The dusty plains of Montana stretched endlessly under the scorching sun as Samuel Creek rode his weathered stallion through the rugged terrain of 1887. His weathered hands gripped the reins tightly, sweat dripping from beneath his worn hat as he surveyed the desolate landscape that had become his home after years of wandering. The former cavalry officer turned drifter had seen enough bloodshed to last several lifetimes. Yet something about this particular morning felt different, charged with an electricity that made his horse nervous and his instincts sharper than usual. As he crested a small hill overlooking the valley below, the sound of gunshots echoed through the canyon, followed by screams that chilled his battle-hardened soul. Below him, a scene of chaos unfolded like a nightmare painted in dust and gunpowder. 3 masked bandits on horseback circled a overturned stagecoach, their weapons drawn and pointed at the terrified passengers who huddled together in the dirt. The driver lay motionless beside the wreckage, his blood staining the earth a dark crimson that seemed to absorb the morning light. Samuel's jaw clenched as he watched one of the bandits dismount and approach what appeared to be a young woman in a tattered blue dress, her golden hair catching the sunlight as she pressed herself against the side of the damaged coach. Without hesitation, Samuel spurred his horse down the hillside, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt revolver that had saved his life countless times before. The thunder of hooves announced his arrival as he charged into the fray, his war cry echoing off the canyon walls like the ghost of battles past. The first bandit barely had time to turn before Samuel's bullet found its mark, sending the man tumbling from his saddle in a cloud of dust and desperate gasps. The remaining 2 outlaws wheeled their mounts around, their faces hidden behind dirty bandanas as they raised their weapons toward this unexpected threat. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense, the crack of pistols mixing with the whinnying of frightened horses and the acrid smell of black powder. Samuel's military training served him well as he used the overturned coach for cover, his shots calculated and precise. Within minutes, the canyon fell silent except for the labored breathing of survivors and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. 2 bandits lay dead in the dust, while the third had fled on horseback, disappearing into the maze of rocks and scrub brush that characterized this unforgiving landscape. As the gun smoke cleared, Samuel approached the survivors cautiously, his weapon still drawn but lowered. The young woman in the blue dress slowly emerged from her hiding place, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude that seemed to pierce straight through his carefully constructed emotional armor. She was perhaps 20 years old, with delicate features that spoke of a sheltered upbringing far removed from the harsh realities of frontier life. Her dress, though torn and dusty, was of fine quality, suggesting she came from means rather than the hardscrabble existence most folks endured in these parts. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling as she surveyed the carnage around them. "I thought we were all going to die." Her accent carried the refined tones of Eastern education, confirming Samuel's suspicions about her background. As he helped her to her feet, he noticed her hands were soft and unmarked by manual labor. Yet there was something in her eyes that suggested depths beneath the surface, secrets that would take time to uncover. The other passengers, an elderly merchant and his wife, emerged from their hiding spots with grateful tears streaming down their faces. The merchant's hands shook as he attempted to thank Samuel, his words tumbling over each other in a rush of relief and shock. His wife, a plump woman in her 60s, immediately began fussing over the young woman, checking for injuries and offering what comfort she could in the aftermath of their ordeal. Samuel surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed too much violence. The driver was indeed dead, shot through the chest at close range, and their horses had either been killed or scattered during the attack. The stagecoach itself was damaged beyond immediate repair, its axle broken and one wheel completely shattered. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, with no transportation and limited supplies. "What's your name, miss?" Samuel asked, holstering his weapon as he began to assess their situation. The sun was climbing higher, and the temperature was rising steadily, making their predicament more urgent with each passing hour. "Elizabeth," she replied, smoothing down her skirts with hands that still trembled slightly. "Elizabeth Thornton. My father owns a ranch outside of Billings." The name meant nothing to Samuel, but he filed it away for future reference, already beginning to formulate a plan for getting these people to safety. The merchant introduced himself as Harold Wickham, explaining that he and his wife Martha were traveling to Billings on business when the bandits attacked. They had appeared out of nowhere, he claimed, as if they had been lying in wait specifically for their stagecoach. This detail troubled Samuel, as it suggested the attack had been planned rather than a random act of highway robbery. As they discussed their options, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. The bandits had seemed particularly interested in Elizabeth, focusing their attention on her rather than the merchant who was more likely to be carrying significant cash or valuables. Her father's ranch outside Billings was prosperous enough to afford sending his daughter east for schooling, which might explain the targeting, but something about her nervous glances and evasive answers to simple questions made Samuel's instincts prickle with suspicion. The nearest settlement was Cedar Ridge, a small town about 15 miles to the southeast, where they could find shelter and transportation. Samuel's horse could carry 2 people at most, leaving the others to walk across the treacherous terrain under the blazing sun. The elderly couple would never survive such a journey on foot, which meant they would need to find another solution or risk losing more lives to the unforgiving wilderness. As they debated their options, Elizabeth surprised everyone by revealing she could ride. "My father insisted I learn," she explained, though her cheeks flushed pink as she spoke. "He said a woman in Montana needed to be able to handle herself in any situation." Her knowledge of horsemanship added another layer to her character, suggesting a more complex upbringing than her delicate appearance might indicate. Samuel made the difficult decision to leave the Wickhams at the stagecoach with what supplies they could spare, promising to return with help as soon as possible. He constructed a makeshift shelter from the wreckage and left them with his spare water and most of his hardtack, keeping only enough for the journey ahead. Harold pressed a small leather pouch into Samuel's hand, insisting it was payment for the rescue, though Samuel suspected it contained the man's life savings. The ride to Cedar Ridge proved more challenging than anticipated. Elizabeth, despite her claims of riding ability, was clearly unaccustomed to long distances on horseback, especially riding double on Samuel's sturdy but uncomfortable saddle. She pressed against his back as they navigated the rocky terrain, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability, and he found himself acutely aware of her presence in ways that disturbed his usual emotional equilibrium. As the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves, Elizabeth began to open up about her life, though Samuel noticed she carefully avoided certain topics. She spoke of her time at a finishing school in Boston, her love of literature and music, and her father's ranch which specialized in breeding horses for the cavalry. Yet whenever the conversation turned to why she had been traveling alone or her plans upon returning home, she became evasive, changing the subject with practiced skill. The sun was setting by the time they reached Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that reflected off the windows of the small frontier town. The settlement consisted of little more than a main street lined with wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, and a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse. Samuel was relieved to see lights burning in several windows, indicating the town was still active despite the late hour. They made their way to the saloon, which also served as the town's unofficial hotel and gathering place. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Jake Morrison, listened to their story with the skeptical ear of someone who had heard too many tall tales from travelers seeking free meals and lodging. However, the sight of Samuel's military bearing and the obvious distress of the young woman convinced him of their legitimacy. Morrison agreed to organize a rescue party for the Wickhams at first light, though he warned that the journey would be dangerous given the recent increase in bandit activity in the area. Several ranchers had reported missing cattle and attacks on supply wagons, suggesting a well-organized gang was operating in the region. The description of the escaped bandit matched reports from other incidents, indicating they were dealing with repeat offenders rather than opportunistic criminals. Elizabeth was provided with a room upstairs, while Samuel bedded down in the saloon's main room with several other travelers. As the night wore on and the other patrons gradually departed or passed out from too much whiskey, Samuel found himself alone with his thoughts and growing suspicions. Something about Elizabeth's story didn't add up, and her nervous behavior suggested she was hiding significant information about the attack. Unable to sleep, Samuel stepped outside into the cool night air, where he was surprised to find Elizabeth sitting on the saloon's front porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. She had changed from her torn traveling dress into a simple cotton gown borrowed from Morrison's wife, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders, making her appear even younger than her 20 years. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly, not turning to look at him as he settled onto the porch steps beside her. The night sounds of the frontier surrounded them, the distant howl of coyotes mixing with the gentle creaking of wooden buildings settling in the cooling air. "I keep thinking about those bandits," Samuel admitted, studying her profile in the moonlight. "Something about their behavior bothers me. They seemed more interested in you than in robbing the stagecoach." He watched carefully for her reaction, noting the slight tensing of her shoulders and the way her hands clenched in her lap. Elizabeth remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the mountains created jagged silhouettes against the starry sky. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and Samuel had to lean closer to hear her words. "There are things about my family that you don't understand," she said. "My father's ranch is more than just a horse breeding operation." Before Samuel could press her for more details, she abruptly stood and announced she was retiring for the night, leaving him alone on the porch with more questions than answers. Her evasive behavior only strengthened his conviction that the attack had been targeted specifically at her, but for reasons that went beyond simple kidnapping for ransom. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with Morrison organizing a small rescue party consisting of Samuel, 2 local ranchers, and the town's part-time sheriff, a nervous man named Deputy Collins who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. They loaded a wagon with supplies and medical equipment, hoping the Wickhams had survived the night without incident. The journey back to the stagecoach proved uneventful, though Samuel remained vigilant for signs of the escaped bandit or his potential associates. Elizabeth had insisted on accompanying them despite Morrison's protests about the dangers involved, claiming she felt responsible for the elderly couple's plight. She rode her own horse, borrowed from Morrison's small stable, and demonstrated a level of horsemanship that impressed the local ranchers who had initially questioned her abilities. They found the Wickhams alive but badly dehydrated, huddled in the makeshift shelter Samuel had constructed the previous day. Martha was running a fever, and Harold's hands showed signs of mild heat exhaustion, but both were conscious and coherent. The rescue party quickly loaded them into the wagon and began the journey back to Cedar Ridge, where the town's doctor could provide proper medical attention. During the return trip, Samuel noticed Elizabeth paying particular attention to their surroundings, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if searching for something or someone. Her behavior reminded him of a scout watching for enemy activity, an observation that added another piece to the growing puzzle of her true identity and the reasons behind the bandit attack. Back in Cedar Ridge, Dr. Peterson examined the Wickhams and pronounced them likely to make full recoveries with proper rest and nutrition. The elderly couple was effusive in their gratitude, insisting on paying for everyone's meals and lodging despite their own reduced circumstances. Harold pulled Samuel aside and revealed that the bandits had taken more than just money from the stagecoach. They had specifically searched Elizabeth's belongings, as if looking for something particular. This revelation confirmed Samuel's suspicions that the attack had been targeted, but Elizabeth continued to deflect his questions with increasing skill and desperation. She claimed her father was expecting her home within the week and that she needed to arrange transportation to Billings as soon as possible. Morrison offered to include her in the next supply wagon heading in that direction, scheduled to depart in 3 days. As evening approached, Samuel found himself increasingly drawn to the mysterious young woman who had literally dropped into his life under such violent circumstances. Despite his wariness about her hidden secrets, he couldn't deny the attraction he felt toward her intelligence, her unexpected strength under pressure, and the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal beneath her refined exterior. Elizabeth seemed equally drawn to him, though she maintained careful emotional distance as if afraid of revealing too much about herself or her situation. Their conversations during meals and evening walks revealed a sharp mind and a deep loneliness that resonated with Samuel's own isolated existence as a wandering former soldier. On their second night in Cedar Ridge, Elizabeth's carefully constructed facade finally began to crack. Samuel found her in the saloon's small library, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a letter that had arrived with the afternoon mail delivery. The correspondence bore the seal of a law office in Helena, and her hands shook as she tried to fold it and hide it from his view. "Elizabeth, what's wrong?" Samuel asked gently, settling into the chair beside her despite her obvious desire for privacy. The concern in his voice seemed to break through her defenses, and she looked up at him with eyes full of pain and fear. "My father is dead," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "He was murdered 2 weeks ago, shot down in front of his own ranch house." The letter fell from her numb fingers to the floor, where Samuel could see it contained details about the brutal killing and the subsequent investigation that had yielded no arrests or significant leads. The revelation recontextualized everything that had happened since the stagecoach attack. Elizabeth wasn't simply traveling home from school. She was fleeing from killers who had already murdered her father and were apparently pursuing her across the territory. The bandits hadn't been random criminals seeking easy money. They had been hired assassins tasked with eliminating the last member of the Thornton family. Through her tears, Elizabeth began to reveal the truth about her father's business activities. The horse ranch had been a front for a much more lucrative and dangerous operation involving the transport of gold and silver from small mining claims to larger processing facilities in Helena and Butte. Thomas Thornton had built a network of trusted contacts who paid him significant fees for the secure movement of their precious metals, avoiding the banks and official channels that were often targeted by organized criminal gangs. The business had made Thomas wealthy, but had also attracted the attention of dangerous men who wanted to control the lucrative trade routes he had established. For months before his death, he had received threats demanding he sell his operation to a mysterious organization that called itself the Montana Territorial Mining Consortium. When he refused, the threats escalated to attempts on his life, forcing him to send Elizabeth east for her safety. Samuel listened to her story with growing anger and determination. The woman he was falling in love with was being hunted by killers who would stop at nothing to eliminate any potential witnesses to their takeover of her father's business. The stagecoach attack hadn't been a failure. It had been a reconnaissance mission designed to confirm her identity and location before launching a more comprehensive assault. "We have to get you somewhere safe," Samuel said, his mind already working through the tactical challenges they faced. Cedar Ridge was too small and isolated to provide adequate protection against a well-funded criminal organization, and the local law enforcement was clearly inadequate for dealing with professional killers. Elizabeth shook her head, wiping away her tears with a determination that surprised him. "There is no safe place," she said. "These men have connections throughout the territory, including corrupt officials and hired guns who will follow their orders without question. My father thought he could fight them, and look what happened to him." As they discussed their limited options, Samuel began to formulate a desperate plan. Rather than running and hiding, they would take the fight to their enemies, using Elizabeth's knowledge of her father's business network to identify and eliminate the leaders of the criminal organization before they could complete their takeover. It was dangerous and probably suicidal, but it was their only chance of breaking the cycle of violence that threatened to consume them both. The next morning, Samuel sent a telegram to an old Army friend named Colonel Marcus Whitfield, who had retired to a ranch outside of Fort Benton and maintained connections with both military intelligence and territorial law enforcement. The message was carefully coded to avoid interception, requesting assistance with what Samuel described as a matter of national security involving organized crime and territorial politics. While they waited for Whitfield's response, Samuel and Elizabeth began planning their counterattack against the Montana Territorial Mining Consortium. Elizabeth's knowledge of her father's records and business contacts would be crucial for identifying their enemies and potential allies in the coming conflict. They would need weapons, supplies, and most importantly, information about their opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Elizabeth revealed that her father had kept detailed records of all his business transactions, hidden in a secret compartment of his ranch house safe. If the killers hadn't found and destroyed these documents, they would contain the names and locations of everyone involved in the territorial mining conspiracy. However, reaching the ranch would require traveling through hostile territory where their enemies would be watching for any sign of Elizabeth's return. Samuel's military experience proved invaluable as they developed a strategy for infiltrating the ranch and retrieving the hidden records. They would approach at night, using the cover of darkness and Samuel's knowledge of reconnaissance techniques to avoid detection by any watchers the criminals might have posted. Elizabeth's intimate knowledge of the ranch's layout would allow them to move quickly and efficiently once they reached their objective. Colonel Whitfield's response arrived via telegram late in the afternoon, confirming Samuel's suspicions about the scope of the criminal conspiracy they were facing. The Montana Territorial Mining Consortium was indeed a front for a much larger criminal organization with connections to corrupt politicians and business leaders throughout the Western Territories. Several federal marshals had been assigned to investigate the group, but their efforts had been hampered by the gang's extensive network of informants and their willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. Whitfield agreed to provide military support for their mission, but warned that official assistance would be limited due to the political sensitivities involved. He would position a small unit of trusted soldiers near the Thornton Ranch under the guise of routine patrol activities, ready to intervene if Samuel and Elizabeth ran into more trouble than they could handle alone. As evening approached, Samuel and Elizabeth prepared for their dangerous journey to the ranch. They selected weapons and supplies carefully, knowing they might need to fight their way out if their infiltration was discovered. Elizabeth had proven surprisingly adept with firearms during target practice behind the saloon, her natural coordination and determination compensating for her lack of formal training. The ride to the Thornton Ranch took most of the night, with Samuel and Elizabeth maintaining strict silence as they traveled across the moonlit landscape. They approached the property from the south, using a series of ravines and wooded areas to mask their movement from any potential watchers. Samuel's military training proved invaluable as they navigated the dangerous terrain without alerting their enemies to their presence. The ranch house sat in a small valley surrounded by rolling hills that provided natural defensive positions for anyone watching the approaches. Samuel counted at least 3 guards posted around the perimeter, their positions betraying military training and professional competence that confirmed they were dealing with experienced killers rather than common criminals. Elizabeth guided Samuel to a back entrance she had used as a child to sneak in and out of the house without her parents' knowledge. The door was hidden behind overgrown bushes and had been left unlocked, suggesting the guards hadn't discovered this potential vulnerability in their security perimeter. Inside the house, they moved carefully through rooms that showed signs of extensive searching by the killers who had murdered Elizabeth's father. Furniture had been overturned, drawers pulled out, and even floorboards pried up in the desperate hunt for the hidden business records that could expose the criminal conspiracy. Elizabeth led Samuel to her father's study, where a large safe stood open and empty, its contents scattered across the floor. However, she quickly moved to a bookshelf and manipulated a hidden mechanism that revealed a secret compartment behind several leather-bound volumes. The compartment contained a metal box filled with documents, photographs, and correspondence that detailed every aspect of Thomas Thornton's business operations. As they examined the contents of the box, Samuel realized they had discovered evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond simple mining claim disputes. The documents revealed connections between the Montana Territorial Mining Consortium and corrupt officials in territorial government, federal marshals who had been bought and paid for, and businessmen who were using their legitimate enterprises to launder money from various criminal activities. Most significantly, they found correspondence that revealed the true identity of the organization's leader, Judge Harrison Blackwood, a respected territorial official who had built his reputation on fighting corruption while secretly orchestrating much of the criminal activity he claimed to oppose. The judge's position gave him access to confidential law enforcement information, allowing him to stay one step ahead of legitimate investigations while eliminating anyone who threatened to expose his activities. Elizabeth stared at Judge Blackwood's photograph with a mixture of recognition and horror. "I know him," she whispered. "He was at our house for dinner just a few months ago. My father spoke of him as a trusted friend and ally in cleaning up territorial corruption." The betrayal added another layer of personal pain to Elizabeth's loss, but also provided them with crucial intelligence about their enemy's methods and motivations. Judge Blackwood's dual role as both law enforcement official and criminal mastermind explained how the organization had been able to operate with such impunity while eliminating potential witnesses and whistleblowers. As they prepared to leave with the incriminating documents, Samuel heard sounds that made his blood run cold. Horses approaching at a gallop, multiple riders converging on the ranch house from different directions. Their infiltration had been discovered, and they were about to be trapped by professional killers who would show no mercy to potential witnesses. Samuel quickly assessed their tactical situation, noting the limited exits and the approaching sounds of their enemies closing in around the house. Elizabeth clutched the box of documents while Samuel checked his weapons, knowing they would need every advantage they could muster to survive the next few minutes. The attack began with gunfire from multiple directions, bullets shattering windows and splintering wooden walls as the killers attempted to pin them down inside the house. Samuel responded with carefully aimed shots that forced their attackers to seek cover, buying precious time for Elizabeth to secure the evidence they had risked their lives to obtain. Using furniture as improvised barricades, Samuel created a defensive position that allowed them to control access to the study while maintaining visual contact with the approaches to the house. Elizabeth proved her worth under fire, reloading weapons and spotting targets with a coolness that impressed even Samuel's combat-hardened sensibilities. The firefight continued for what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Samuel's military training and Elizabeth's desperate determination kept them alive, but their ammunition was running low and their enemies showed no signs of retreating or giving up the assault. Just when their situation seemed hopeless, the distinctive sound of cavalry bugles echoed across the valley, followed by the thunder of hooves as Colonel Whitfield's soldiers charged into the battle. The professional killers found themselves caught between Samuel's defensive position and a cavalry unit trained in frontier warfare, a tactical nightmare that quickly turned the tide of the engagement. The surviving attackers fled into the darkness, abandoning their siege of the ranch house rather than facing capture by federal troops. Samuel and Elizabeth emerged from their improvised fortress battered but alive, clutching the evidence that would finally expose the criminal conspiracy that had cost so many lives. Colonel Whitfield's debriefing revealed the full scope of Judge Blackwood's criminal organization and its connections to corruption throughout the territorial government. The documents Elizabeth and Samuel had recovered would provide federal prosecutors with enough evidence to dismantle the entire network, but only if they could survive long enough to present their testimony in court. The colonel arranged for Elizabeth and Samuel to be transported to Fort Benton under military escort, where they would remain under federal protection until Judge Blackwood and his associates could be arrested and brought to trial. However, Whitfield warned that the judge's connections and resources meant the danger was far from over, even with military protection. During the journey to Fort Benton, Elizabeth and Samuel finally had time to process everything that had happened and to examine their feelings for each other in the context of their shared ordeal. The violence and danger had stripped away pretense and social conventions, revealing the genuine affection and respect that had developed between them despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. Samuel realized that his attraction to Elizabeth went far beyond physical desire or the excitement of their dangerous situation. Her intelligence, courage, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds had earned his admiration and love in ways he hadn't experienced since losing his family during the war. For her part, Elizabeth found in Samuel a strength and reliability that had been missing from her privileged but emotionally sterile upbringing. At Fort Benton, they were assigned separate quarters but spent most of their time together, preparing their testimony and planning for the future beyond the immediate crisis. Colonel Whitfield kept them informed of the investigation's progress, reporting that federal marshals were systematically arresting members of Judge Blackwood's organization based on the evidence they had provided. However, Judge Blackwood himself remained at large, reportedly fled to Canada or Mexico where he would be beyond the reach of territorial law enforcement. His escape meant that Elizabeth would never be completely safe as long as he remained alive and free, a reality that cast a shadow over their plans for a future together. The trial of the captured conspirators became a territorial sensation, with newspaper reporters from across the region covering the proceedings and Elizabeth's testimony about her father's murder and the organization's criminal activities. Samuel provided military expertise about the armed confrontations they had survived, while federal prosecutors used the recovered documents to build an airtight case against the defendants. The verdicts were swift and decisive, with most of the conspirators receiving lengthy prison sentences or death penalties for their crimes. However, the The knowledge that Judge Blackwood remained free continued to haunt Elizabeth, who feared he might return to exact revenge against the woman who had destroyed his criminal empire. As the immediate legal proceedings concluded, Samuel and Elizabeth faced decisions about their future together and apart. Samuel's wandering days were over, his heart now firmly anchored by his love for the remarkable woman who had changed his life so completely. Elizabeth, despite her fears about Judge Blackwood's potential return, was determined to rebuild her father's legitimate business activities and create something positive from the tragedy that had brought them together. They were married at Fort Benton in a simple ceremony attended by Colonel Whitfield and his officers, beginning a new chapter in both their lives that would be built on love, mutual respect, and the shared understanding that came from surviving mortal danger together. Samuel's military pension and Elizabeth's inheritance from her father's legitimate business activities provided them with the resources to start fresh, away from the violence and corruption that had defined their early relationship. But even as they exchanged vows and planned their future, both knew that Judge Blackwood's escape meant their story was far from over. Somewhere beyond the reach of territorial law, their enemy was likely planning his return and his revenge against the couple who had destroyed everything he had worked to build. The question was not whether he would come for them, but when, and whether their love and determination would be enough to survive whatever final confrontation awaited them in the uncertain future of the American frontier.